Welcome to Plastisphere, the podcast on plastics, people, and the planet. My name is Anja. According to my calendar, it's 2026 now, but we still don't have a plastics treaty. We do have some updates for you. Joining me again is Magnus Lovold from NAIL, the Norwegian Academy of International Law, and one of the long-term observers of the plastics treaty process. Welcome back to the podcast, Magnus.
Thanks a lot, Anja. It's good to see you again.
So the last time we spoke was during the heatwave in Geneva, and I think we said we would do a wrap-up on the last day together, but then we didn't, because the negotiations just dragged on and on and on and into the night. And in the end, we did not get a treaty. And I guess we all needed some time to digest that afterwards and try to understand what really happened there. And we didn't hear much from you, but 1 month later, you were back on your blog on Medium with some rather intriguing news. And when I read it, I was like, wow, get me my popcorn. But before we spill that tea, let's go back to that day in August. Let's say at sunset. I remember we were all sitting outside in the grass around the United Nations building, taking photos of the sky and just waiting for something to happen. And I believe at that point, there had already been one draft presented for the treaty, which was pretty wholeheartedly rejected as incredibly weak by many people working to tackle plastic pollution. But there was still hope for a substantial revision. So how do you remember that last evening? And what did you learn in the weeks that followed?
Yeah, I remember that whole day and that whole night as very long, first of all. I stayed up for about 30 hours in total, so I was completely exhausted at the end of all of this. So I went straight home to try to get some much needed sleep. But I think towards the end of what we call INC 5.2, which was the resumed session of the fifth round of plastic treaty talks, I think it was all about the big question that everybody had and what everybody talked about was what we refer to as the chair's revised text. So you're absolutely right that the chair, Luis Valles of Ecuador, he had produced a text of his own earlier in the week, and that had been received, I think, by particularly progressive countries, but also by civil society and others as a very weak text, a very weak treaty text. It contained no real rules. It didn't really provide a credible response to the problem of plastic pollution as we have talked about it throughout these negotiations, right? So that was clear in sort of that was not accepted as a new basis for negotiations. And then we knew at that point that the chair was working on a revised draft. It was very much expected that would be a stronger draft, a more ambitious text. And at that time, at the sunset at the UN in Geneva, I remember it also. It was in early August, and it was incredibly hot, but we were all waiting. And I remember the resumed session in Geneva being a lot about waiting in general. We just waited for text to be released. And I think a lot of the delegates as well just was there waiting to receive news and receiving text. And that's basically what we did. We waited to receive the revised text and hoping that would be better than the first text.
Right. And if you have time to wait, you also have time to speculate. So, yeah, we were all wondering, like, why did Luis Valles come out with this super weak draft? Like, what happened there behind the scenes? Was this just a strategic move to have everybody reject it so that it was obvious and public that, such a weak treaty could never be agreed upon? And I remember there was like announcements, plenary at, 3. And then, oh no, plenary was postponed until 6 or so. I don't know the precise times anymore, but it was just postponed. And yeah, for me, at some point, my feeling was this will drag through the night. And it did, but you stayed.
I did indeed. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one thing to highlight here is that at the meeting in Geneva in August, but also maybe throughout this process, there's been some complaints. Some delegations feel that a lot of decisions have been made behind closed doors, so not in a really transparent way. So when you have an outcome, when you have a text coming out, you don't really know what considerations that have been behind that, who's been involved in the drafting, and who's seen it, who hasn't seen it, etc. And a lot of basically meetings taking place in so-called informals or informal informals, which are sort of formats that they normally use in these contexts. And then as a result, you don't really know. And particularly if you're an observer, then you basically just shut out from the whole thing. You don't really know. You can try to get information from some of the delegates that may be or may not be in the room, but it's very, very chaotic, I think, generally, as a feeling that you have. And I think as well that that feeling of waiting and waiting, that's the state we were in at that point, at that evening in August. And then we heard about an announcement there was announced a plenary that would take place like just before midnight, like later in the evening. And, we gathered, everybody came to the plenary room, like then hoping then, okay, some update on this text and what would happen. And basically, it was the shortest plenary meeting that I have ever seen. It was basically just for the chair to open the meeting. He said, just updated the room that consultations on his revised draft were still ongoing. And then he adjourned the plenary meeting. And apparently I learned afterwards that basically he had to convene that plenary because the session was about to run out of time. So the meeting was only supposed to take place until midnight, right? And if it were to go into the next day, you needed sort of a decision by the plenary to actually continue negotiations. So that was the whole purpose of having that plenary. And then, this super short plenary with no answers given. And then I think people just started to laugh, almost in a half mocking way, because like, what do we do with this, right? It's midnight and we're already now on overtime. And we're waiting for a revised text that we haven't seen. We don't know what it's about. And I think that was very much the state that people felt very agitated and quite frustrated at that time.
Right. I went to bed and I remember waking up right the moment when basically everybody had agreed that there was not going to be a treaty that day. It was early morning. I think you stayed there. I don't know, probably got some of the sandwiches that were distributed for the tired observers and negotiators. And then basically we went all home and the media said, the plastics treaty has failed. But let's get to that interesting insight that then you published a month later, because I had no clue about it until your blog post.
Yeah, so a text was released just after midnight. And then in the early morning, basically they met again in the plenary to conclude that there was basically no agreement on that text. They had consulted throughout the night, they had negotiated, they tried, and they had even made progress according to some reports, but it wasn't enough. It was too late and too little, and therefore they just had to conclude the meeting and resume at a later point. So that's basically where it left off. But in between, in the middle of the night there, between this plenary and the end of the meeting, I was on my way from one of the buildings to the other. I don't remember exactly what. We were just waiting still for the revised text to come out. And then I received, and a lot of people received, a WhatsApp message on one of the WhatsApp groups that I've been part of, where it says that UNEP just called a meeting with CSOs only. And that was all the meeting said. And then we sort of walked around. The meeting there was somewhere in one of the buildings. Yeah.
What are CSOs?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So that's CSOs is just an abbreviation for civil society organizations. And UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, they have all kinds of different roles that they play at these conferences. And one is to liaise with civil society organizations, making sure that their input is received and that they're well taken care of and that they listen to and inform them about what is happening. So in a sense, not so strange that UNEP would convene a meeting for civil society organizations only, but of course also like, what is this about? Why in the middle of the night? I mean, so just very suddenly that there's a meeting convened without any explanation of what it was about. And then people started to walk from one building to the other building where this meeting was supposed to take place. I didn't go in there because I was focused on waiting for this revised text to be released and preparing for that. But then I heard from other colleagues that were in that room that the meeting had indeed taken place. It had been a very strange meeting. And basically, it had been in that meeting a discussion about removing the chair from his position, which I immediately said, like, that's really weird. First of all, civil society organizations may be important, but they don't have the power to remove the chair from his position. The chair is elected by the member states, and the member states decide. And secondly, it sounded really weird to me that UNEP would be the one organizing such a meeting, because, of course, UNEP is the official secretariat to these negotiations and definitely should not be involved in any discussion about removing a chair that has been elected by the committee. So this sounded really weird to me, and I didn't hear much more about it then. I mean, we received a revised text and started analyzing that, and then we were super tired, and ultimately we came home. But then it wasn't until a little bit later when I did my sort of trying to figure out what had happened and analyzing a little bit what had happened at the meeting in Geneva that I like, what is that about? So I started to talk to some people, and I quickly realized that this was much stranger than what I had initially thought. And I talked to people that had been in that meeting, and I learned that indeed it had been convened by a staffer, so a staff member of the UN Environment Programme, part of the secretariat to the INC, the negotiations, and indeed that the UNEP staffer had also indicated that there is a need to replace the chair. And I was initially just, listening to people that had been in the room telling me what they had heard. And they sort of all lined up, but it was nothing concrete until I learned that someone had made a recording of that meeting. And I managed to, I didn't obtain the recording myself, but I listened to it, and I was allowed to take notes to listen to that recording. And then I learned that indeed the UNEP staffer had said, that we have been too nice and saying that executive director of UNEP needs to somehow get involved in this because the chair has been asked to step down. So the staff members said these things, and also encouraging the civil society organizations to come forward and do something about it. And the civil society that were there, they reacted to this. They said it was really weird, and it sort of felt like almost like a plot to overturn the chair coming from the UN itself. And they reacted. Many of them reacted immediately very strongly, and that's also, I think, why some of them were speaking with me about it. I learned about this and managed to establish that this was actually true and accurate, and that in itself, of course, is a story from a journalistic point of view, because again, this is a serious breach. If, when these things happen, a staff member can't plot to overturn a sitting chair. To do so would be a breach of UN staff rules and code of conduct. That's in itself a story. But for me, it was more important, like, why? Why would they do such a thing? Like, why would they?
So basically, as far as I understood it, it was between the two drafts. We had that super weak draft that the chair presented where we were all thinking, is this strategy or just a bad dream or what? And then there was a second one, which I don't know when it came out, but sometime during the night in the early hours. But this meeting takes place in the middle, between these two drafts. And what is the call to action of this UNEP staffer to the civil society organization? Should they get active right away and try to get the chair to step down or something before the second draft is presented, or should they do pressures? So I don't know. It's so strange. We can only speculate, but what were the different versions that went through your mind where you think, oh, this could be why?
So, initially I thought maybe there's just someone in the UN, among the UN staff, that I just haven't slept enough and, just feel a little bit agitated and frustrated like everybody else, and just, just said things. So that was my initial thought, that this is just like, okay, someone is just really tired and really need to get some sleep. And that was just sort of an error. But then I learned also by talking to people that had been closer to the development of these texts. We talked about the first text, the revised text that came out and turned out to be quite a bit stronger than the first one. And I learned that there had been significant disagreement internally between the different people that have been involved in drafting that text. And actually that UNEP Executive Director Inger Andersen herself, she had initially been opposed to releasing this more ambitious text, that she actually wanted to go with the weaker version, sort of on the theory that you have a sort of very lowest common denominator treaty that is not ambitious, it doesn't deliver any solutions, but it's so low ambition and it's so sort of lowest common denominator that maybe at the end of the day, maybe everybody will agree to it. Maybe the ambitious majority will even accept it, because for them, it may be better to have a weak treaty than no treaty at all. And then when there was this proposal of making a more ambitious treaty, that of course would probably make it harder to achieve the kind of consensus. That's at least one theory.
So the theory in that sense would be that UNEP just has an intrinsic interest to finally close this process and come to an agreement, and that could have been a motivation. And I think we have to note that this is just some hypothesis, right, that you probably heard.
So this is based on my sources, I do believe that the executive director of UNEP, Inger Andersen, she actually preferred the first text and the first draft text, and also that UNEP and the INC Secretariat, which is sort of part of UNEP, that they were involved in the drafting of that text. That's not speculation. That I believe is to be true, and I have sources to back that up, right? But of course, then when it came to the question of developing a more ambitious second draft, whether UNEP tried to stage a meeting to overturn the chair in order to prevent the release of that draft, that's a hypothesis, definitely. I don't know whether that is the reason. I'm just saying it's one possible explanation for why such a meeting would take place, right? Because I find it hard to explain otherwise why a UNEP staffer would engage civil society organizations in a conversation about overturning the chair or forcing the chair of a committee to resign like that. But then I learned that at that time, when this meeting took place, it was exactly when the decision to release this revised draft text was to be made. And you can look at the timestamp on that document that sort of confirms that it was actually in the same time. So I looked at these things, and these are just weird coincidences, right? So I just tried to put two and two together. But again, I don't know and still don't know the real motivation for why a UNEP staffer would organize such a meeting, why a UNEP staffer would try to encourage civil society organizations to call for the chair's removal. I don't know. I'm just saying that one possible reason is that, as you say, UNEP has an interest in achieving an outcome. They wanted to get a treaty by consensus, and probably they saw the most likely path to such a consensus was to stick to the initial text and insist on that text and basically force that through the committee. So that's, again, it's based on what I know, but of course it's also very much a hypothesis. There's a lot we don't know about what happened that night, and a lot that I think I would like to know, but it's also very hard, given that so much of these discussions are taking place behind closed doors and with very little transparency. It's very hard to actually independently verify what is going on and what is not going on.
Right. And we talked about this in previous episodes. Basically, negotiations get less and less transparent. So, we have the plenaries that are live over the web. Everybody can watch them around the world. Then we have the smaller discussion groups, right? But still, civil society is allowed to take part, but not the press. But from there are levels of obscurity that just get more close and close.
Degrees of obscurity, yes. Yes, indeed. So some of the stuff we're talking about here, you can go to UN Web TV and look it up and actually see this very short plenary meeting that I talked about, like 15 seconds or something. It's there, it's still there, it's recorded. And that's all in public, and everything that has happened there is public. And then you have, you're right, the contact group meetings, and they are more informal. So the rules of procedure in those meetings are normally relaxed. They still apply, it's still part of the proceedings, but they are relaxed. So you can have more interactive discussion, you can speak for longer. Just allow for more informality. And that's just to try to, that kind of informal discussion will hopefully generate more agreement is the thinking. And then sort of under that, again, you have informals, which is normally meetings on a particular topic, a particular question, or it could be also on a particular article. And that's normally convened by someone who's interested in convening these meetings. They may be mandated by the contact groups, sometimes these informals. As civil society, they have access to the contact groups, but they normally don't have access to the informals. So in the informals, things are for states only. So if you have a state contact, he or she can tell you what is going on, but otherwise you don't know. You're right, the press don't have access to even the contact groups, but civil society otherwise do, or NGOs otherwise do. And then you have informals, which is even sort of higher on the level of informality, which is that's just a group of states at the margins of a negotiations meeting to coordinate and discuss, and it's not scheduled. So you will not see these informals in any schedule released officially. While the informals are normally released, and informals are normally also open to all delegations. So these are different, but again, some of these are not legal terms. None of these things. Plenary is a legal term because that is written in the rules of procedure. But contact groups, informals, these are not legal terms. These are practice, so based on practice, and it varies to some extent from arena to arena. But these are quite common terms, particularly in multilateral diplomacy.
And then we have the informals, which is basically the Gulag party. The best party during the INC, where I think hosted by the South American states.
Yeah, that's true. It's normally at every round of negotiation in this process, there has been a GRULAC party, the group of Latin American and Caribbean states. They are definitely the best party organizers in this process. Yeah. And that's, yes, indeed, very informal, and normally involves quite a lot of alcohol as well.
Yeah. So it does have potential for consensus or for compromise there.
Or the opposite. I mean, alcohol can have many effects on people.
Yeah. Okay. So we're back at these levels of intransparency. Where did we leave off in the story of that night? Well, we were speculating, basically, or what do we know about this mysterious meeting that happened? What could be the motivation for it to happen? We don't know if the staffer acted alone or really on behalf of UNEP.
No, what we have heard since this, because this was also reported, I believe, in The Guardian. So there was reported on this in The Guardian, and that led the executive director of UNEP, Ingrid Andersen, to formally say that she had nothing to do with this meeting. And also she confirmed to Associated Press, this was afterwards, of course, that an investigation had been opened by the Office of Internal Oversight Services, which is the entity in the UN system responsible for looking into allegations of breach of UN staff rules and code of conduct. So there's an open investigation there now. But so based on what we've heard, is that at least the executive director of UNEP had nothing to do with that meeting. That's what she's saying. But otherwise, what happened and why it happened, we still don't know. Will we know? I don't know, but I would really like to find out what the outcome of this investigation is and will be. So that's something to look into for the future, I think.
Right. And then on October 7th, I don't know, this might be the Guardian article which you're referring to. Some of the journalistic colleagues who were there on the site, Emma Bryce, Louise Kruger, Bernard Ogambo, and Conor McGlone, reported in the Guardian that actually the chair, Luis Vallas, was gonna quit and was going to step down with the process in turmoil. And he was quoting personal and professional reasons. So in fact, he was not going to continue leading this process.
No. And that's the outcome, right? Luis Valles, the ambassador of Ecuador, who's been leading this process since INC3 or the end of INC3, decided to step down. And then, of course, that's interesting as an outcome, since that was exactly what was called for in this meeting at INC 5.2 in Geneva. But at the same time, we don't know, of course, I don't know whether that has these things are directly related or not, just seeing that is the outcome. And then The Guardian did their reporting on that. But indeed, so that, of course, is interesting because, then the chair steps down. And then since then, the committee, now we're in February, and the committee has been trying to identify and elect a new chair, because these committees and these processes, they need a chair to preside over the meetings and preside over the efforts to move things along. And that's where we're now.
And just one question on Luis Valles, because I remember when we spoke in previous episodes, he was the second chair of the process. And I remember you putting quite some hope into him and his diplomatic capacities to be a strong chair and to lead this treaty process to success. So how do you look back on his tenure now?
Well, it's a bit mixed, I think. On the one hand, I think you've seen significant progress under Valles' chairpersonship. You have, in the run-up to INC5 in Busan, he took an initiative to develop what we refer to later as non-paper. So these are draft treaty texts that became the focus of negotiations and actually provided the last meeting in Busan in 2024 with a basic proposal and provided with focus. And I think that effort was really significant, providing actually moving the text, the negotiations forward, providing greater clarity on what the key political and legal choices that negotiators were confronted with in this process actually were, identifying them clearly. And I think that was really significant in terms of text development, that the work that he did there, and that he obviously. We also know that he made his absolutely core best to try to reach an agreement here, to the point of also providing these draft texts that we just talked about during INC 5.2 and trying to get an outcome by consensus. But of course, at the same time, the committee was supposed to and expected to conclude its treaty by the end of 2024. And of course, we know now it didn't. And then it had one extra chance to conclude at this meeting in Geneva. And again, it didn't. And the fact that these things didn't happen, I think to some extent you can say, like, well, are there things that a chair could have done differently, organized differently? Definitely can be discussed. But of course, also these decisions are ultimately sort of the states. It's the states that negotiate this treaty. It's the states that needs to agree. So that's also, I think, a factor here, that when it comes to blame for a lack of outcome in these multilateral processes, I think it becomes very, very quickly, I think, a political game of its own, where people don't want to blame themselves and they want to push it onto someone else. But of course, this treaty is negotiated by states, and states that are responsible for moving things forward. We know that the chair actually has quite limited ability to move things forward if states don't agree. And then, of course, the fundamental aspects of this process is that, well, from my perspective, we have seen significant spoiler activity. We have indications of some states not actually being interested in negotiating a treaty, but being in this process in order to derail and delay efforts. And then when you don't have in this treaty this process clear rules of procedure, clear decision-making rules, which were decisions made before Luis Valles took up his chairmanship, then of course it becomes extremely difficult to move things along. But at the same time, things, of course, you can always in hindsight, think about ways that things could have been done differently. But I think it's also just, a result of the fundamental political dynamics of this process. That's the reason why we didn't get an outcome.
So for quite a while, the process was basically chairless, we could say. There was a vice person, right? A vice chair taking care of it.
They called it presiding vice chair.
Right. Yeah. But Luis Vallas was not active anymore. But we now have some promising news, right, since a few days, because I think unbeknownst to many, or unbeknownst to most of the public, there has been another negotiation session, which was the meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, INC 5.3. And that happened last week, right? And you were there. So what are the news, and what does that promise possibly for the continuation of this process?
Indeed, you're absolutely right. I don't know why we refer to these meetings by like software update language, like 5.1, 5.2, 5.3. But that's how it's become. It's because it's a resumed session. So legally speaking, INC 5, which started in Busan, South Korea in 2024, that was never closed. So that session, that negotiation session, is legally speaking still open. And that's the session that was resumed in Geneva. And since that was to distinguish that from the meeting in Busan, they call it 5.2. And then you're absolutely right. In Geneva on Saturday last week, that would be the 7th of February, the INC 5.3 took place. And that was, you're right, it's a negotiation session. It was a session of the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee, but it had a very narrow purpose. And the only purpose is exactly correct, to elect chair to replace Luis Vallas as chair of this process. So that's why they met in Geneva, and they managed to elect a chair, and that was quite nice to see. And I think it's just telling that if you do set yourself some clear objectives, some achievable objectives, and then you follow the rules, there are clear rules for how to elect a chair, and if you follow those rules, it is possible for this committee to move forward, even if the political dynamics are otherwise quite tense. There was an election. There were 3 candidates: one from Pakistan, one from Senegal, and one from Chile. And there were 2 rounds of voting. So this will be quite familiar for people, in a democracy, when you elect, your government or whatever, your president. So there were 2 rounds of voting. And at the end of those 2 rounds, the ambassador of Chile, Julio Cordano, emerged victorious. So he received 92 of the votes cast, and that was a clear majority. So yes, the process has a new chair. That's Julio Cordano of Chile. He didn't say much, and as he was just elected, and then he was sort of come up on the podium and he had to give a little speech. He didn't say much about what his plans were. We don't know what his plans are. He said that he would like to look at ways to organize the negotiations more efficiently, which I think is to be welcomed. But otherwise, we don't know much about next steps. Of course, the big question is when the next session of the next substantive negotiation session will take place. And I think I'm hearing different things. Some people are talking about August. I've heard September. I've heard November. I've heard December, and then I've also heard maybe not until 2027. So we don't know, but I'm pretty sure that that's on top of the list of to-do list of the new chair, to try to get an agreement on when, at least, and of course also where the next session will take place. So to say that the session and the negotiations, although it has so far failed to get us a treaty on plastic pollution, is still very much ongoing, and there will be more talks. So people haven't given up, which is, I think, good news for those who are caring about the environment.
Great. So stay tuned. I think that's the perfect moment, Magnus, for you to take your bet. What's your guess? When will the negotiators finally agree on a global plastics treaty? Will it be the INC 5.4, the INC 5.5, the INC 5.6, the INC 5.7 to 5.9, or will it be INC 5.10 or later?
So I think that at INC 5.4, then that meeting will close, and then there will be a decision to organize INC 6. So there will be a new session with a new agenda.
Okay.
So I would say either INC 6 or maybe not until INC 7.
And maybe we have to wait for more favorable geopolitical conditions for this treaty too. Well, if they get more favorable.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't count on that. I would rather go ahead. I think that it's better sooner than later, because I'm worried that it's just going to get worse. So if we can do something now, it's just going to get harder. And I think, to be honest with you, I think that throughout these, it's now 4 years since the UN Environment Assembly adopted the decision to negotiate a treaty on plastic pollution. And I think over those 4 years, things have gotten more difficult. Geopolitically speaking, much more difficult, much more tense. It's harder. The fronts are stronger between different countries and different groups of countries, etc. And I think, the more time that passes, the harder it's going to be to get an agreement here. So I would, again, as I think I've done before, I would encourage negotiators and countries to really try to put this in the bag as quickly as possible, so that we can, and of course also because we urgently need these solutions, knowing very much and seeing every day the consequences of plastic pollution around the world.
That's true. Thank you so much, Magnus, for sharing your thoughts and being a guest on the podcast again. And I'm sure we'll we'll have many more episodes to come on this series. And I do hope we can call it How to Make a Plastics Treaty in the end.
Absolutely. Great seeing you, Anja. And stay tuned for the next chapter. Definitely. This is not over.
For the next Grulak party.
Exactly.